Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat. Resolves.
Right.
Now, before you attack
Does
me,
anyone have an answer?
well played.
Good game.
Hello everyone, my name is DJ. Hello everyone, my name is DJ and you're watching the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel. I have an exciting new commander deck for you today. You know how they say storm is a broken mechanic? Well, how about a creature storm deck? I want to take a look at Ryonya Fire Dancer. Ryonya Fire Dancer is 3 red for a 3/4 legendary human wizard. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. They gain haste, exile them at the beginning of the next end step. The reason why I say this is a storm commander is because you just cast instant and sorceries and suddenly you get more temporary copies of your relevant creatures. First thing I want to do is jump right in and find out what cool creatures are out there to copy. If I'm going to make 5 or 6 temporary copies of a creature, I want them to be exciting and impactful. Next, I want to see if I can reliably get there. Are there enough little instant and sorcery spells that we want to play that will trigger Rionya reliably and get me all of those cool copied creatures? And then finally, are we going to rely too heavily on Ryonya? Is this a sort of glass cannon where we need all the instants and sorceries to line up, our commander to stay on the battlefield, and a relevant creature for this deck to be good? Let's find out. But first, let's look at the cool things to copy, because if this deck is just making an additional copy of a cool creature, I'm all in. I think the creatures are going to be key here, because Ryonya doesn't need a bunch of instants and sorceries. You'll automatically create 1 token copy. If you happen to create more, then that's just great. So as long as we have relevant creatures, we're gonna do just fine making temporary copies. And so I think that in red, we have to first look at what deals a ton of damage. So Stormcaller deals 2 damage to each opponent. Make a bunch of those, do a bunch of damage. Fanatic of Mogus deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of devotion to red you have. If your commander's on the battlefield and you create a bunch of copies of this, remember, each copy is going to trigger separately and each copy brings its own devotion to the battlefield. So that's a huge bunch of damage all around the table. Finally, we have Terror of the Peaks. It's a 5 mana, 5 powered dragon. Of course it flies and has all this other text on it, but really, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So if you just create another copy of Terror of the Peaks, the original Terror of the Peaks triggers off of it, but also the new Terror of the Peaks triggers off of it too. And so you can see how the damage gets really big and overwhelming when you have 4 or 5 or 6 entering the battlefield. I also like how you can choose where the damage goes. Okay, 5 needs to take out that utility creature, 10 needs to take out that creature over there, and Ashlyn needs 15 damage to the face. Stuff like that. Of course, there are creatures that lend some utility, but then get even more broken as you start multiplying them. Goblin Settler just takes out a land, and there can be problematic lands that you need to answer. But if you start copying Goblin Settler, you can lock an opponent out of the game pretty easily by just blowing up all of their lands. This is pretty mean, but Goblin Settler is pretty expensive, so don't feel like you need this in your deck. Goblin Chain Whirler is a really good one because it can take out all of those small creatures, but if you put a bunch of these onto the battlefield, it can be this sort of mini board wipe effect that also deals damage to all of your opponents. And then finally, Solemn Simulacrum. It ramps you really, really well, and that's all you need. Remember, Rionya exiles the creature at the end of the turn, and so you won't get that dies trigger from the Solemn tokens, but if you have a sack outlet, maybe you will. Next, we have some creatures that leave bodies behind. Seasoned Pyromancer. You can give us a really good looting engine, create some bodies, have some value from the graveyard, just an all-around solid card. Emrakul's Hatcher is one of my favorites here because these 0/1 Eldrazi spawns are actually ramp, and if we are doing some sort of storm thing, the more mana we have access to, the better. And of course, there's Siege Gang Commander, leaving behind a bunch of little goblins. Next, we have some creatures that have really favorable attack triggers, because remember, all of these creatures should be attacking. Handware Garrison can make some more little tokens, and if we're making a lot of them, this can get out of hand. Tectonic Giant can be a huge boost of damage, dealing 3 damage to each opponent when it attacks, and if you have a few of them, this could be a really game-ending threat. Not to mention some ability to do some card selection. And then finally, Goldspan Dragon. This is just a great dragon to have to just sort of save up your mana for these big storm turns. We also have some other treasure synergies, so doubling up the treasure output is going to be really good too. Of course, there are a few cards that attack really, really well, better than all the others, because Combat Celebrant and Lightning Runner both will go infinite with your commander. Because these are creatures that grant extra combat steps, they work very well with Rionya. Combat Celebrant works a little bit better. So Ryonya says, hey, I'm going to make an extra token copy of a creature. Choose Combat Celebrant. You can then exert that token copy to give you another combat phase. Attack whoever you want to with whatever you want, and then you get an extra combat phase, and Ryonya says, hey, I hear you want to make another creature. Let's make another Combat Celebrant. You can exert that one and continue the ultimate infinite combat phases over and over again. There are also a few ways to get even more value out of your Rionya. You can keep a lot of your tokens with Sundial of the Infinite. At the beginning of the next end step, Ryonya is going to put a trigger on the stack that says, hey, exile all those tokens that I created. With that trigger on the stack, you can just end your turn with Sundial of the Infinite, and then your turn just ends. It's not supposed to happen, but everything on the stack, like those get rid of your tokens triggers, is just poof, gone. And that means that your tokens stick around. You can also double up your tokens with Lithoform Engine or Strionic Resonator. But what's really great is that, yes, Rionya is a triggered ability, but we're a deck full of triggered abilities. Triggered ability is using the words when, whenever, and at. So of course, at the beginning of combat, it's a trigger, but when this creature enters the battlefield, when it attacks, yeah, there are so many different triggered abilities, and so Strionic Resonator works with literally every card in here, not just our commander. Okay, so I might have been able to convince you that just creating a couple tokens is really good, but I mean, we didn't just pull out Ryonya to create 1 or 2 tokens. We want to storm off and create 5, 10, 15 different tokens. That is the fun commandery thing to do. So we have to look at our constraints when it comes to Storm. Usually they're mana and cards. So let's take a look at mana first. Battle Hymn, Jessica's Will, and Mana Geyser can all produce a ton of mana. Jessica's Will, by the way, also gives us access to some cards. We can also take care to generate small bits of mana at the sacrifice of card advantage. Desperate Ritual, Poetic Ritual, and Seething Song all create some mana. I think I'm a little bit more excited about mana generation that can stick around or create a lot of it. I'm actually a fan of Wily Goblin in this deck, because when it enters the battlefield, you create a little treasure token. So you can play Wily Goblin and have that treasure for later when you're storming off, or create several copies of this little Wily Goblin and go off with treasure. Of course, the goblin that creates treasure that we're really all thinking about is Dockside Extortionist. This card is expensive because it is so excellent. Dockside Extortionist can create a ton of different treasures. We can even copy it with Rionya, going really wide with treasures, and then it'll be easy to storm off in the future. And then we have a sorcery that creates treasures, but also gives us that card advantage that we need. Next, we have some creatures that help with mana generation: Runaway Steamkin, Bergi, God of Storytelling, and Stormkiln Artist. Of course, if we have creatures that synergize with the spells that we're casting, Gutter Snipe is going to be really great. And of course, we have a bunch more creatures that synergize with our spellcasting: Direfleet Daredevil, Wildfire Devils, and Goblin Dark Dwellers. So it seems like mana isn't going to be our issue, but card draw might be. We have a lot of looting effects like Cathartic Reunion. There's a few others really similar to it, Faithless Looting. But also, I think that we might be missing some of the wheel effects. I have Wheel of Misfortune right here, but if you are fortunate enough to have Wheel of Fortune, then you can include that too. I really think that you need cheap ways to refill your hand if you're playing these one-off small mana generation effects like Seething Song. Of course, there are creatures that can draw you cards, and if you're creating a bunch of these, then you might be able to easily refill your hand. I particularly like Humble Defector because you can create these token copies that are going to be gone at the end of the turn, and they have haste. So you create a bunch of copies, tap them all, draw 2 cards, give them to whoever, and then they'll just get exiled. Sky Scanner, cheap, getting to draw some cards. Combustible Gear Hulk, it is sort of a Punisher mechanic. Your opponent gets to choose if you draw cards, but trust me, if you make enough Combustible Gear Hulks, you will be drawing cards because the threat of that much damage can be huge. So I think we can imagine this deck curving out, playing relevant creatures that have enter the battlefield effects, which are good in our format. Being able to sift through our deck, and maybe we're saving up a few cantrips, a few different mana generation spells, so that when Rionya finally drops, we can create a bunch of different things. But does this deck rely too heavily on Ryonya? Is this a glass cannon? Well, if it is, let's just build around it. Deflecting SWAT defends your commander against removal. Tybalt's Trickery is a counterspell that definitely gives your opponent something, but could protect your commander right before you're about to go off. And then Lightning Greaves is a ubiquitous form of protection. And remember, you got a lot of relevant creatures in this deck too. Remember, Rionya does say target creature, so maybe Swiftfoot Boots instead. Look, I feel like these one-off mana generation effects like Desperate Ritual and those cheap cantrips that don't really do much in Commander, those are much more on the explosive Rionya side, and I think that that can be fun. You are going to want to get 7 or 8 copies sometimes when you're playing Commander, even if it makes your deck a little bit more delicate. But remember, on the other end of the spectrum, these powerful creatures that you would just play in any deck and that are just good can just be good without you even ever playing your commander. So I really think that you can tune this deck to be as glass cannon as you want. There are of course other ways to make sure that your Rionya deck is robust, and that's by including some combos in it. Dualcaster Mage is great in this deck because it can double up some of the cheap instants and sorceries, so you might want it anyways. Heat Shimmer and Twin Flame are solid because that's what Ryonya does. They create token copies, and you can just get that relevant enters the battlefield effect. But together, these two go infinite. With Heat Shimmer on the stack, Dualcaster Mage can come in and create a copy of it, and then you can just let that one copy resolve, and then that will create another Dualcaster Mage. The original Heat Shimmer is still on the stack, not resolved yet, and so you can go ahead and copy that spell, and then that keeps going over and over and over again until you have infinite hasty Dualcaster Mages. Finally, next isn't a combo, but it's just another mode of attacking your opponent's life total. Perforos, God of the Forge. If you're gonna be creating a lot of relevant creatures, you have relevant enter the battlefield effects, you can create a bunch of tokens with cards like Siege Gang Commander, Handwear Garrison, then Perforos just makes sense. Rionya is great. It just rides the line between a Spell Slinger deck, a Storm deck, and a value creatures deck. And that's so fun. You're not all in on one combo. You can be copying different creatures every single time. One day, Rionya will be making a ton of Gutter Snipes, and you'll try to drain someone out. Another time, it'll create a bunch of Emrakul's Hatchers that gives you a bunch of different little Eldrazi that will ramp you into your Terror of the Peaks. You just don't know, and it's gonna be fun every time. Thank you so much for watching this video. I want to thank Cool Stuff Inc. They're the sponsor of the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel, and if you use the coupon code JUMBO5, you'll save 5% off your order. Make sure to pick up some singles from Commander 2021. I know I've picked up a lot of singles from my Commander decks. I also want to thank my patrons. They're amazing, and they support every single video. Thank you, patrons. And thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and you're going to be off building your own Creature Storm deck soon. Bye-bye, everyone.